Greetings, viewers. I have not done one of these on-screen talks in a while. Been very busy writing and had some family issues to take care of. But I did want to do a little overview of my latest project, which I just finished, and that's Volume 5 of this long-term project on history that I've been writing. And more specifically, a history of empires and anti-colonial resistance between 1492 and 2008, and I'm calling it Meditations on Geopolitics. And specifically, the text I just finished was a text that's called Global Steam, and it covers a period of history from 1860 to 1914. So this is the second half of the 19th century, the second half of the British hegemony. The British Empire was the single most powerful empire and very much the hegemon of the world system in the 19th century between 1815 and 1914. And then we had that interim period of the two world wars, 1914, 1945, and then another period where the United States became the world hegemon between 1945 and 2008. So this text is looking at the second half of the British hegemony. And I wrote it for a bunch of reasons, which are way too complicated to go into. I wasn't satisfied with a lot of the national histories of empire, or rather, not satisfied, but I felt something was missing in most of the national histories. And this is this problem of all these empires are actually located next to each other, and they're competing with, against, and occasionally cooperating with each other. So something crucial is missed when we just focus on one empire. Most of our histories are, of course, national histories. It's still a huge problem today. And maybe one of the central problems of the 21st century is that we're entering a period where we have 8 billion people on this planet, around 200 polities, and we have to tell histories that include everyone. All 200 of those polities, all 8 billion of us deserve to have our stories told. And that's very difficult because we went from a world system dominated by empires. Approximately back in 1910, 14 empires controlled 90% of the world's population and about the same proportion of the world's GDP. So just 14 political units. That was humanity back in 1910. And of course, that's all changed. Now we're up to 200 and counting. There may be more in the future. So I wrote this partly as a reaction, as my own desire to see a more transnational history. But I want one thing to be clear. I did not write this as a way to put the historians out of business. I wrote this text because I want a conversation to happen between historians of different empires, different periods, different fields, and between members of the humanities, literary scholars, cultural critics, communication scholars, all across the humanities. I want everyone to be able to start to talk with and communicate with each other in a much more complex way. And what that meant was that this text is much more than just a set of histories. It deals with history in a very different way. So I deal with three types of history. One, economic history. So I look at economics, sociology. I'm also looking at politics. 19th century is full of dynastic empires, but also democratic mass movements and the first anti-colonial resistances. And then finally, culture. So late 19th century is sort of the 0 hour of industrial mass culture and of the culture industry and all the complicated, very, very contradictory phenomena associated with that. This transition from dynastic culture, nobilitarian culture, subsistence farmers creating their own local forms of primarily rural culture to a world system where culture is now a big business and industry in its own right. So it's actually a set of all those histories and a history of all of the empires, all 14 of them get a place, all wrapped up in one. Now, as to how I did this, well, I did it in a very incomplete fashion. I'll be the first to say, yes, there's a lot I had to leave out. It's not possible to cover everything. But I tried to hit the high points. And I tried to glom on to some of the leading tendencies of certain periods. Maybe the best way to explain why and how I did this is just to go through the chapter list. There are 12 chapters to the text. By the way, it's enormous. It's online. Feel free to download it and read it and critique it, provide commentary. It's 140,000 words. It's 361 pages, so it's enormous. It'll take you a while to get through. It's extensively footnoted. Excuse me. It's extensively footnoted, and tons of citations. One of the reasons that it took me 2 years to write was I had to do the hard work of reading all of the historical work, especially recent historical work on the 19th century, integrate that into what I was writing. So let me just briefly go through the chapter list, and then I'll come out and explain where the history project is headed, because I'm now in the process of writing the next chapter, the next huge volume, which will be, of course, 1914, 1945. So 1860 to 1914, 12 chapters. The very first one, chapter 1, is called The Rail Junction of History. My basic argument is that the second half of the British hegemony is best understood as that moment where industrialization really starts to impact human history in a serious way, where we have mass industrialization of large areas of the planet. And this starts to change everything in ways that were not true of the first half of the 19th century. This involves a whole raft of transformations, and I just cover some of the largest ones. We have the extension of settler colonialism. We have agro-industrialism. We have the colonization of entire river valleys. We have the transformation of ecosystems. So the Mekong River, the Mississippi River, the Nile River, the Ganges River, the Irrawaddy River, these all become the locus for massive colonial or neocolonial projects that feed into industrialization in various ways. And so an enormous number of changes happen. That sort of sets the stage. And I deliberately use the metaphor of rail junction in a very specific historical way. I'm being very specific there because the argument is that the previous period of the 19th century, it's the first half of the British hegemony, 1815 to 1860, it's very much run by the British, and you could argue it was sort of the best metaphor would be the construction of the railroads. Now that happens, of course, 1830s, 1840s, but that whole period is something like a railroad line being constructed. Whereas 1860, 1914 is when you have a bunch of railroads that have been set up, and then you have something else happen because now you have railroad junctions. You have this density of railroads, and that changes things. It's a quantitative change that turns into a qualitative change. Okay, so that's the brief overview of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 focuses on one of the central features, and this happens early in the second half of the 19th century, and that is the 4 abolitions of wageless labor. There are 4 imperial regions that employed forms of wageless labor all throughout the world system, and they were enormous, and they constituted something like close to 1/5 of the planet's surface. These are enormous things. Slavery in the United States South, serfdom in the Russian Empire, slavery in the Brazilian Empire, and slavery in that portion of the Spanish Empire in Cuba. So all 4 of those regions, and they were part of enormous empires and imperial projects. And what happens is, during the first 20 years of this period, 1860, 1914, which I call global steam, I'll refer to it as global steam from now on. The first 20 years of global steam saw a series of uprisings and abolitions of wageless labor, and this occurred partly through violence, partly not through violence. The United States took a civil war. In Brazil, it occurred peacefully, 1888, because the elites changed their opinion and had a different strategy past a certain point. In Russia, it was in the middle because it was actually the result of violence. Russia's defeat in the Crimean War of 1854-1856. They were fighting a coalition of the Ottoman Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire. They were completely defeated, and the dynasty went through some changes and realized, oh, we can't rely upon serfdom anymore. We have to change our system fundamentally and begin the process of industrialization. And that's exactly what happened in 1861. And finally in Cuba, where again violence was involved. The 10 Years' War, the enormous insurrection that started out, that had elements of slave insurrections against the Spanish elites, that turned into an independence movement. It was partly bought off, partly crushed, and then through a slow series of transformations, slavery finally ended. And but the desire for an independent Cuba continued, and many of those old struggles lived on. And there's a direct link between abolitionism in Cuba and the struggle for Cuban independence. This is also true in the United States. The struggle against wageless labor is also the struggle for numerous forms of civil rights and labor rights, women's rights, electoral suffrage, and so forth in the United States in the 1860s, 1870s. So the chapter covers these four abolitions and compares and contrasts them, and does some preliminary comparisons of the different empires and their place in the world system. It also points to this problem of outcome. So the abolitions were very uneven and unequal. The United States had the most complete abolition, but then it had the most powerful capitalism. The Russian abolition of serfdom was very incomplete because it got rid of serfdom, but it didn't transform the former serfs into subsistence farmers or fully waged workers. It transformed them into partly waged workers, primarily into sharecroppers. Very comparable to the kinds of exploitation in the American South, comparable to the exploitation of the Brazilian interior, and comparable to the debt peonage and sharecropping and other forms of sort of not quite fully waged exploitation, but not quite old style slavery that occurred in the Cuban countryside. And that has important consequences for all these societies later in the 19th century. Third chapter, I'm looking very specifically at the emergence of the United States as a core polity. And by core polity, I mean something very, very specific. So I have my own take on Emanuel Wallerstein's very productive, very useful notion of the world system. I also have some differences from Wallerstein because I don't think he includes the Russian Empire and the semi-periphery enough, and there's some blind spots in his analysis. So my take on the core polity thesis, the core semi-periphery is core polities are capitalist empires or polities that are self-financing, that are not reliant upon another core polity for technology or finance or trade or market demand. So it's a measure of independence. It's not complete autarky or freedom from foreign relations or trade, but it means that you're independent. You're not dependent upon some other polity. And before 1862, there were roughly four polities in the world system that had that power. Britain, obviously, France, and the Netherlands and Belgium. So those four. In 1862, the United States joins them and becomes the fifth core polity. And it was able to do this. It was able to move from the semi-periphery to the core because of the institutional changes of the Civil War. And amongst the most important of these, a whole raft of changes and transformations, the creation of federal bureaucracies and income tax and power of federal state and putting down rebellion and other things. But one of the most important, often overlooked, is the democratization of land. So access to not free land, but to cheap land was a core political demand of the Republican Party. That's why they became successful in the 1850s and 1860s and challenged the other parties and got Lincoln elected. And the core platform was affordable land for settlers. And the South didn't like this because their model was unfree, wageless labor to farm that land. And so free labor farming the land was a threat to their economic model, which is why the election of Lincoln in 1860, the South rebels and tries to secede, starts the Civil War. So anyway, the point is, in 1862, the United States Congress passes legislation authorizing the land grant system. And this opens up enormous tracts of land in the Midwest and far west of the United States that have been, of course, conquered from other polities and other empires or stolen from the indigenous Americans, but it renders them accessible for mass settlement. And the basic idea is that if you're a settler with no money, you can go and farm the land, and after a few years, if you pay a little bit of taxes and so forth, you can own the title to the land. So it cheapened the cost of land, created a huge land boom in the United States. And so a massive flow of people went to the West and started to farm or tried to farm. Some succeeded, some didn't. But this flow of people onto the Midwest and far West, this was the central driver that drove the American industrial machine. All those farmers, they weren't peasant subsistence farmers. They were producing for the market, so they needed commodities. You needed to supply them via railroads, so the railroads were built, and then they would send for equipment. They needed farm equipment. The Midwest turns into this big producer of farm equipment. So the United States industrialization takes off because of this economic model. So farming is actually crucial to the whole story and the settlement of these regions. And of course, it involves a lot of terrible violence, ecological violence, obviously, because you're farming the land and draining its fertility, but also you're ethnically cleansing, genociding, destroying the indigenous, the First Nations indigenous cultures that were there. So that's also a terrible tragedy. Again, part of the story as well. So the same Union Army that was defeating, slavery in the South was also committing war crimes against Indigenous Americans in the far West at the same time, sometimes in the same year. It's a very, very tragic story that worth pondering and thinking about to this day. Point is, after the end of this process, the United States becomes a core polity and begins to grow and grow and grow, and then starts to catch up to Britain and France and become a major player in the world system. Now, chapter 3 is also where I do something a little new. A lot of these histories focus just on the economics or politics. I cover those, but I also cover the aesthetics of this transformation. I'm looking specifically at the poetry of Emily Dickinson, because her greatest poems are very profound meditation on the very difficult, painful, and traumatic transition to go from a semi-peripheral culture to a core polity culture. This is a lot harder than it sounds, because all the things that were functional when you're semi-periphery stop working when you're core polity. And you need to think differently about the world. Identity changes, culture changes, gender changes, sexuality changes, race changes, class identity changes. The world is structured in a very different way. And it's very difficult to become a core polity, and it's not a simple thing. There's a whole other set of conversations to have about that in the late 20th century when the number of core polities increases. Anyway, the point is, the United States achieved that, and it generates this new culture. Chapter 4 of my text is not looking at the core polity, it's looking at the semi-peripheries, and it's looking specifically at what I call 4 consolidations in the global semi-periphery, and that is the unifications of Italy, of Japan, the consolidation of Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay, and of course the unification of Germany. This is the period from roughly 1861 to 1871, and each of these consolidations were very, very, very contradictory. Generally, they occurred under a dynastic reorganization of some kind. Italy, 7 or 8 polities unite and become one dynastic kingdom with some industrialization. Japan unites the different feudal principalities into a coherent nation state under what later was called the Meiji Restoration, 1868. The South American countries fight a brutal war against Paraguay because of Solano, the dictator of Paraguay, attacked them and tried to take them over, and so they fought back and eventually defeated Paraguay. A lot of people lost their lives. It was very, very tragic for Paraguay, a lot of destruction and death, but it consolidated the South African system of states, and all the states they modernized through this war. And in fact, the military establishments that Argentina and Brazil created would become powerful political entities and would change the course of history of those polities after and during the 1880s, 1890s, and so forth. And then finally, Germany, a German case of unification, where Prussia takes over all the other German states and amalgamates with the other German states to form this huge continental power that fights wars with its neighbors, and then fights the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 and defeats France on the battlefield, becomes a major player in the European system. So each of these consolidations is very complex, very messy, full of contradictions, because they're modernizing, but they also result in the potential for revanchism because they're all under dynastic auspices. The Meiji Restoration is a wonderful example. It's modernizing and creating industrialization, but it also creates a new dynastic kingdom. So Meiji, as the name implies, Meiji Restoration, meaning the emperor, now has complete power and becomes basically the modernizing dictator figure of the society, whereas before it was, other figures uh, had more power than the emperor and actually did the ruling. And that changes after 1868. Chapter 5 takes all the themes of the first 4 chapters and expands them a little bit further. And what I'm doing here is asking some questions about the long-term trajectory of change. And the name of the chapter, Despotic Industrialisms, National Imperialisms, Industrial Modernisms. These are a reference to 3 important categories of the first half of the 19th century. Industrial despotism, imperial nationalism, and industrial realism. Okay, now hear me out for a second. I know these are words, they don't seem to mean anything. What I'm talking about basically is how economics, politics, and culture are changing in the 19th century. So global cotton, this is the period from 1815 to 1860. So when I say industrial despotism, I'm talking about slavery. Yes, the Atlantic slave system is still going on, and of course workers exist in the textile mills of Britain, conditions a little short of horrendous violence and horrendous exploitation. So this industrial despotism that exists all across the world system becomes the dominant model. Imperial nationalism, so how Britain legitimated its rule, how the French Empire ruled, how the American Empire ruled prior to 1860 and so forth. And finally, industrial realism. That's simply a name for sort of the cultural works of that period. And that includes everything from Beethoven's music all the way to the great works of the writers of 1848, Charles Dickens, and the early period of Charles Dickens and so forth. So chapter 5 is sort of updating this and taking those concepts and pointing and showing how they're changing. So industrial despotism, this world of slavery and textile mills, turns into despotic industrialism. So I invert the terms. And despotic industrialism means there's a kind of industrialization that does the oppressing and the violence, and it's kind of despotic to its own core. So you have these giant ruthless corporations that start to do evil things, and giant colonies that do evil things, colonial machineries that do evil things, as opposed to a slave master doing evil things. Okay. Same change where you go from imperial nationalism to national imperialism. That's an important political shift. So imperial nationalism, it's still under a kind of a king. It's for the emperor. National imperialism, suddenly citizenship is about your capacity as an individual to be an imperial subject. So that's the position of, say, the American white farmer who goes and takes land and thinks nothing of, taking land that actually belonged to the First Nations in order to grow food, in order to sell that to some giant corporation somewhere. And then, of course, discovering that giant corporation is despotic industrialism. The railroads are bilking you and trying to cheat you, and then, of course, the farmers rebel. But from the standpoint of national imperialism. So it's a set of politics and institutions and structures based upon national empires, no longer upon the sort of imperial structures that are essentially feudal or dynastic. These are modern capitalist empires that start to function. Finally, this cultural shift from industrial realism, so that's the culture of the 1820s, 1830s, 40s, 50s, and a later culture of industrial modernism. The main aesthetic example that I show here, and I chose this artist specifically for this reason, I'm looking at Wagner's Siegfried and Twilight of the Gods. So this is the second half, the final 2 operas of his Ring Cycle. The Ring Cycle was a series of operas they wrote between 1854 and 1873, and they're wonderful. They're incredible works of art, but they're also great diagnostic tools because the first 2 were created during global cotton, and the last 2 were created during global steam. And they both reflect those 2 time periods. So you can literally hear the history in the transformation of the music. And so I analyze not just the music, also the text and the libretto, and the characters and the action, because opera, its action is happening on the stage. It's a kind of a theatrical component to it. Unpacking it, looking at it carefully. And one of the interesting things about Wagner is he gets tagged for being reactionary. Now, as a person, he was, of course, fairly awful as a human being and treacherous and deeply anti-Semitic late in his life. Horrible person. But he was a great artist, and his works of art are actually profoundly revolutionary. So his works of art are deeply, deeply progressive, even though he personally was very much a scumbag as a human being. Lost cause as a human being, but a great artist, and that comes out in the work that he does. Okay, that's chapter 5. Now, next chapters. We're getting down the list. So 6 through 12. Chapter 6, I'm looking at the periphery. And this is a very grim part of the analysis. The chapters 6 and 7 are sort of the political tentpoles of this text, because chapter 6 looks at the incredible destruction and violence that the empires are doing to the periphery. And they do it through agro-industrialization. So it's not just the old settler colonialism or the drain of wealth from the colonies. That's going on. Unequal trade, of course, that's happening. Settler colonialism, yeah, that's happening. But what's even worse now is that the periphery is being systematically destroyed from an ecological standpoint as well, through massive construction projects, massive hydraulics projects. The construction of the Suez Canal, which was very costly in terms of life, the damming of the Mekong Valley by the French colonial administration. They transformed into this huge zone of the production of rice, but they also created all these ecological problems. The British take over the Nile, and so the Egyptian peasants produce cotton instead of food. This triggers famine, but the stagnant pools of water required to grow all this cotton turn out to create schistosomiasis, snail disease, and then so horrible, horrible human toll is generated by this agro-industrialization. Of course, the profits are taken out of the colonies and go into the pockets of London financiers instead of the people that actually produce the wealth. This leads to chapter 7, and I call chapter 7 Sightings of the Nautilus, 1862-1878. And this chapter is looking at the first industrial resistances of global steam, and what I call basically the creation of the first industrial commons. So these are sets of institutions, practices, forms of resistance, forms of solidarity, forms of commonality, forms of cultural production, whereby partly waged, wageless, and fully waged workers are all trying to unite to create a better life for themselves. And I also look at specific uprisings where you see this commons sort of emerge briefly. The most famous example, of course, is the Paris Commune, one of the classic examples of a revolutionary movement that erupts at a certain time, certain space, gets mass participation, creates a lot of reforms, and then is brutally crushed in a very tragic way. But it's not the only example. There are many other uprisings, and there's a slow work of the commons, which is, again, just as important, and that is the battle over civic structures, over education, over public health care, over public infrastructure, over water supply and making sure your water isn't contaminated, and public health measures and so forth. All these are actually part of the battle over the commons. Now, the commons, of course, is very limited at this time. Literacy is very intermittent. A lot of the working people don't have access to knowledge or science, and they have all the problems of their societies. So the commons is very relatively weak compared to what it's become today. Today, we live in the era of a sort of a transnational commons. It's incredibly powerful and dynamic. So we can critique this early version of the commons, but it's also good to go back and think about what it achieved. And the other thing that it achieved was a template for some wonderful works of art. And of course, Sightings of the Nautilus, that's a reference to Jules Verne and his wonderful science fiction story, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And it's very much true. Captain Nemo really is the first great revolutionary figure of the industrial commons. He's the first proletarian hero who's, kind of the archetype of the good scientist who's there to save the world. That science fiction stories would refer to the distant predecessor of Otakon and the Metal Gear saga. That's all there. It's all there, actually. And very interesting that that's the French version of the story, whereas you can kind of look at the British industrial commons, and the comparable figure, of course, was Sherlock Holmes. It's very interesting, the differences, national but also imperial differences between those two figures. Finally, this chapter focuses on a raft of other works of art associated. And so looking at painting and culture, poetry, so a wide range. So I'm doing a much broader sort of field analysis of sort of the structures of industrial modernism and why and how they emerge, particularly in the core polities at this time. during this period, 1862, 1878. Now, the last chapters. Chapter 8 is titled The Three Lockdowns of the Semi-Periphery. And here's where our story starts to take on a sort of a pre-1914 energy. This chapter looks at, okay, industrialization is taking off. It's bringing good and bad things. But what happens to this system of empires that Britain has set up? The system of empires starts to turn antagonistic, starts to escape the power of the British control, and the reason is the system restrains or prevents the semi-peripheries from industrializing. So the same logic that enabled them to achieve certain things also locks them into certain forms of what I call geopolitical closure. Now I have three models for these lockdowns. I have Argentina, I have Germany, and I have Russia. And these were not chosen by accident. Each of them represents a certain kind of semi-peripheral lockdown. Argentina is the most successful of the oligarchic republics of the semi-periphery, which flourished up and down Central and South America and a few places in Europe as well. So if you look at economies of places like Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, and so forth. So small economies, semi-peripheries, not core polities, still dependent upon outside technology and finance. Some of them manage to develop, some don't. But the model has huge problems, and Argentina does succeed at becoming somewhat wealthier, but then has all these internal problems that lock it into a long-term structural immiseration, in which it is still trapped to this day. It's actually a very horrible story. To this day, Argentina is in trouble and has never been able to break out of the semi-periphery, and it's still being impoverished to this day. This is a story that has continued for literally 150 years. The second example, the lockdown of the German Empire. Very successful amongst the sort of the comparable national imperial capitalisms, so comparable to Italy and Japan and some other places, but runs into the problem that it's not big enough to have its own internal markets, and it's dependent upon finance, and it makes the crucial mistake of enraging a core polity. So Germany in 1871, it takes Alsace-Lorraine province that was part of France for literally 200 years. And in fairness to Bismarck at the time, who was the Chancellor of Germany, the thinking was, oh, this is just another territorial annexation. That's what you do when you win a war. You just take some territory and everything is fine, right? The problem is France is a core polity, and if you enrage a core polity, they won't cooperate with you, and they're going to make your life difficult, and they'll mobilize against you. And no semi-periphery has ever succeeded without the full support of a core polity. Even to survive, you need a core polity. And no semi-periphery has ever become a core polity without full integration in political, economic, and military and all the other kinds of integration and support from the core polities. The United States was very lucky. In 1862, the Union States had that cooperation. Now, Britain did not break the blockade or try to arm the Confederacy for very good reasons. The Union kept their bills and kept their word, and they were a good customer, and all of Britain's money was in the North, not the South. So they stayed friends and said, well, you put down the rebellion and we'll continue to finance your economy. And then after the war, the United States didn't need it. It had independence, but it continued to trade normally with the other core polities. By the way, this is also true in the late 20th century when the number of core polities expands from 5 to 36. All the ones that have become core polities, Japan, countries in Europe that have joined the core, all went through this process of integration, of democratization, of mediatization, of plebeianization that got them closer to the core, both culturally, politically, and economically. That's how you do it. If you try to cut yourself off from the core polities, you fail. If you try to wall yourself off, you fail. If you try to be hostile, you fail. If you put all your money into the military, you fail. Okay. Finally, the last lockdown is that of the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire is fascinating because in many ways it's the most successful of the dynastic empires of capital of global steam. The Spanish Empire, Portuguese Empire, Austrian Empire, and so forth. And the Ottoman Empire. So Russia succeeds, and it grows to this enormous empire and has all this plus. It has this huge army, it's this mighty power. It seems to be very successful, but the problem is it's not really successful. It expands, but precisely because it expands, it ends up having these huge and almost indefensible borders with a bunch of other empires. So whereas before it just had, it was a small power relatively, but it had very defensible borders with empires that didn't threaten it, now it's 1/6 of the Earth's surface. It stretches all across Asia and parts of Europe, and as a result, it has to compete with all these other empires. It has to compete against a powerful German empire, against a powerful Austrian empire, against a still existent Ottoman empire. It's bumping up against the British Empire to the south, and it has to deal with the Qing Empire and the Japanese Empire. So no other empire has this problem. So even though Russia is the most successful of these dynastic empires, they're in trouble. They're not able to join the core or to do more than just barely keep up. The general metaphor that I use for the lockdowns is the famous parable of the Red Queen and Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, and the notion that the Red Queen has to run faster and faster just to stay in place. That's a great metaphor for the semi-peripheral empires during global steam. They have to run faster and faster and faster just to barely keep their place in the hierarchy, and they're not catching up with the core. In fact, they start to fall further behind. They grow desperate and more desperate, and they become tempted to gamble and do desperate things. And this is one of the main drivers for the explosion of 1914. Okay, I'll be a little quicker about this because I've gone on a lot. Chapters 9, 10, 11, 12. Which are sort of written all together for some interesting reasons. These last chapters are looking at the period 1878 and onward, sort of the second half of global steam. Chapter 9 is looking at some of the works of art of this period that are located in the semi-periphery. And I make an argument here that the tremendous cultural productivity of these artists of the semi-periphery between 1878 and 1904 has some very peculiar characteristics. And the reason is there's a divergence between what they're doing and what the industrial modernists of the core polities are doing. They kind of go in separate directions. And the reason is that the core polities and those artists are engaged in the early culture industries. Whereas in the semi-periphery, you don't yet have the culture industries to that extent, but they are faced with the problem of creating national publics. The core polities, they have their national publics. They exist already. The issue is they're going through massive industrialization of those publics. The semi-periphery is in the process of creating those publics in the first place, and that makes it very different. So this is the difference between, say, the great semi-peripheral painter like Ilya Repin, the great Russian painter, has a much more realistic or naturalistic sort of use of color and paint and so forth and visuals in his works. Great artist, great painter, but much more naturalistic use of imagery versus Monet and the Impressionists. And there's a reason for that, and it's the whole structure of the society is the French Empire versus the Russian Empire. Very, very different spaces, and so the industrial modernisms sort of separate. They're parallel. They don't separate completely, but they sort of go in slightly different directions, run in parallel. And then at the end of this period, after 1904, they'll start to converge again. Very interesting. And I back up this thesis by some close readings of some of the great works of art from the semi-periphery of this time, and specifically Ibsen's Dollhouse, Wagner's Parsifal, great opera, his last opera, and Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. So I'm doing some in-depth literary, musicological, and visual analysis. I also have analyses of Machado de Assis from Brazil, Brahms and Bruckner, some more musicology, analyses of Tchaikovsky, the Russian composer, and then finally analysis of Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German thinker, philosopher, and writer. Basically arguing that all of these folks, what ties them all together is that because they're in the semi-periphery, they have some wonderful and very unique productivity in their work. It limits their work because they're limited to a certain space, but it makes them very interesting, and they have some unique innovations all of their own worth paying attention to and understanding and reading. One of the real surprises for me that I'd really not appreciated the work of Anton Bruckner, the great Austrian composer sufficiently before I'd actually sat down and wrote this text and went back. I'd heard most of his works, but hadn't realized how great of a composer he was. Particularly his symphonies are just masterpieces, are incredible works of art. I understood, the greatness of Brahms, Assi, Tchaikovsky, but Bruckner was a bit of a revelation, and I'm very glad I was able to sort of think that through and give him his due as one of the greats of the late 19th century. Okay, last 3 chapters, and they all sort of run together. Chapter 10, Oceans of Contestation, and I'm basically looking at the new maritime empires that emerge after 1878 to contest British control of the high seas. And this includes everything from the maritime empires in terms of surface navies and that expansionism, but it also looks at economic empires based upon maritime trade, in particular the spread of gold-backed currency systems. And this gold-backed currencies, so the gold standard tied to the British pound sterling. This is a thing, and it becomes important, and most polities are still on silver, but the leading imperial powers try to switch to gold as a safeguard, and it has to do with the nature of imperialism and projecting imperial power. Some succeed, some don't, so I go through that. The other thing with this chapter is I, again, do a fairly broad analysis of a whole range of industrial modernists located primarily in the core. So this is sort of the reaction. Chapter 9 is looking at the semi-periphery, so chapter 10, I'm looking at the artists and the core polities. And everyone from Van Gogh and his paintings, the poetry of Rimbaud, Bram Stoker's Dracula, a whole analysis of Dracula, one of the great anti-capitalist horror tales of the 19th century. Mallarmé, Throw of the Dice, great poem. Kate Chopin's The Awakening, Henry James' Golden Bulb, and the music of Scott Joplin. There's a very eclectic, broad range of materials, heavy on the novels, I know, but that's a bit of my background because I was a literary scholar back in the day and occasionally still am. So looking at all these things as examples of this logic of core artists that are doing things and sort of reacting to the new culture industries that are emerging. Final 2 chapters, chapter 11, One Core Integration, 2 Doom Loops, and the last chapter, Britain's Hegemonic Twilight. And they sort of go together. So here's the long and short of these 2 chapters. I'm looking at the prelude to 1914. And what happens in 1914? Well, everything blows up. Well, why did it blow up? It blew up because 2 of the main mechanisms that kept the peace in the world system had disappeared as early as 1904. The 2 doom loops. And so the 2 doom loops they're my ironic way of referring to 2 of the most interesting features of the British world system of the 19th century. And that is the 2 truces. There are 2 truces between groups of empires at key points in the world system. And the first truce, again, I didn't invent this idea. This is something that Paul W. Schroeder, the great historian, came up with, this notion of the truce between the Austrian, Prussian, and Russian empires between 1763 and 1914. That they fought occasional wars, but they didn't destroy each other. And of course, the bell rings, so I have to stop. Let me pause this. All right, continue where I left off. So the issue with the doom loops is that there were 2 large truces in the world system between 1815, late 18th century to the late 19th century. The first, and Paul W. Schroeder has talked about, the truce between the Austrian, Prussian, and Russian empires. They did not fight or go to war. They more or less had a stable balance between them. And then it blew up in 1914 because the competition got to be too much. So that truce ended and turned into a shatter belt of war. And the competition between those powers turned absolutely toxic and violent and became a terrible bloodletting of the world wars. But there's a second truce, no less important. Between 1689 and 1894, 3 other empires didn't go to war. The empires of China, Russia, and Japan. They did not go to war. And the reason was they didn't have the maritime means to fight. So it was much less an issue of policy. They just didn't have the wherewithal. They weren't maritime powers. But they were all mighty empires, mighty powers, but they did not fight. until that moment in 1894 when Japan, in post 1868 industrialization, is powerful enough to launch a war and to defeat Qing China, 1894, 1895, launching its imperialism against China, and trail of blood and tears and exploitation, which would eventually result in the catastrophe of 1945. Point is, both of these regions blow up between 1914 and 1945, and this is not an accident. What kept them from blowing up was the power of the British Empire. So British supremacy and the Concert of Vienna and British diplomacy and British might, and persuasion and so forth and so on. So this chapter basically looks at how it falls apart and why the internal competition between the empires sort of pulled the truces apart in various complex ways. The other subtitle to Chapter 11, Core Integration, this is looking at another unexpected result of the late 19th century, and that is the 5 core polities stop waging war against each other. They realize after 1890, in certain cases the 1880s, as early as the 1880s, definitely by the 1890s, and absolutely by the early 1900s, that's just not worth fighting each other. It's unprofitable, it's risky, it's unpredictable, it's just bad for business. It's much better to respect the other core polities and their empires, to compete on a more or less fair playing field, agree to settle your differences through mechanisms. Now, this has nothing to do with the benevolence of their imperial elites. This has to do with that the 5 core polities go through a very profound internal democratization in the late 19th century. So democratization of culture, democratization of politics, democratization of economics, all that is beginning to happen. You have the rise of trade unions, of progressive parties, you have right to free speech, free assembly. Yes, of course, there are limits on this. So women don't have the right to vote in most of these polities. African Americans aren't allowed to vote in the American South until the 1960s. My goodness. So there's all kinds of these are deeply, deeply, deeply flawed and problematic democracies. But they democratize enough to the point where their elites can't start imperial wars easily. They have to get consensus. They have to get buy-in. They have to appease the press. They have to get popular support, popular legitimacy. It's not just a question of a king issuing an order. That those structures are still there for the semi-peripheries, which is why the doom loops happen. They go ahead because the emperor commands this and that, and so then catastrophes start to stack up. But the 5 core polities have much more democratic structures that start to emerge, and this prevents them from going on that same path. That creates shock absorbers or buffers. And so they start to draw closer together and start to cooperate at the same moment that the semi-peripheries start to double down on colonial adventurism and imperial war. And you can see where this train is headed. This is the lineup of World War I. It's like, it's not an accident that Belgium, France, the United States, and Britain, 4 out of the 5 polities will unite as the Entente. That's not an accident. That's not some magic. No, there's no counterfactual you can spin to say, oh, it was an accident, it could have happened differently. Actually, no, and you look very carefully at how those societies are structured, how their empires are structured, how their empires were changing, you realize that was the only option for those societies and for their specific empires at that stage in history. 50 years ago, it would have been a very different story because they still thought differently. But those polities after 1900, no, they would think in a certain sort of way. The very last chapter of the text is Britain's hegemonic twilight. And hegemonic twilight is a somewhat idiosyncratic term that I basically invent to talk about this very strange period, sort of the last decade of global steam, looking at all the ways that British rule is fading, but still powerfully influencing everything that goes on. And there are new challengers that are there. The Americans are there, and they're taking over the economy. And Germany is there, and Russia's there, and Japan is there, and Italy is there, and the French are there. So there's enormous competition and stress and strain and so forth. But Britain is still more or less in charge until the very, very, very last second. And this chapter also looks at a few of the works of art of that time. The special focus on the great works, the late masterpieces of Gustav Mahler, great Austrian composer, whose work is also a wonderful document of another logic that happens. Now, the previous chapter talked about the divergence of the artists of the core and the artists of the semi-periphery. Well, after 1904, there's a reconvergence. The core and the semi-periphery, they start to converge again. And you can actually hear this. You can hear this in Mahler's late works. You can also hear it in the work of the other composers. I have sections in there covering the work of Debussy from France and from Charles Ives, the great American composer. Reading sort of this complex geopolitical contradictions that are sort of influencing, and you can hear them and access them and sort of map them out in the musical material and in the aesthetic works that they're creating. So this is the gist of it. Well, the text ends in 1914, just when everything goes to Heckle and Jekyll. And I'm currently in the process of writing the next volume of this Meditations on Geopolitics project, and that's going to cover the period 1914 to 1945. And I'm just calling it the third super cycle, because it's the third great episode of hegemonic aspiration, contestation, and planetary war since 1492. First being the 30 Years' War, the second being Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars, the late 18th century, early 19th century. And it's going to be quite a large project, and it's going to do a lot of the same things that this project will do in terms of drawing upon economics and politics and aesthetics all at once. It's also going to do something perhaps somewhat new, and that is a settling of accounts with the 20th century left. Because we have to go back and we have to think about what worked and what was a catastrophe. What was genuinely progressive, what was a failure. In other words, looking at that next stage, and I mentioned before about the industrial commons, late 19th century, you have the first industrial commons. And one of my arguments in this text will be that there's the next stage, there's a kind of an international commons that emerges at this time, and it has certain achievements to its credit, it also has limitations, flaws, and we have to be honest about the mistakes. We have to be self-critical. We have to see the full history of everything that went right, but even more importantly, everything that went wrong, so as to not make the same mistakes, go in a new and better direction in the 21st century.